In every town there is a building that seems to hold more than bricks and mortar. A place where stories gather like dust, whispered from one generation to the next. For this town, that place was the old school. At first glance it looked ordinary: red brick walls, tall windows that let in rays of morning sun, a bell tower that had long since stopped ringing. But if you lingered long enough in its shadow, you could sense something else, a heaviness in the air, as if the school itself remembered things it wasn't willing to share. Children felt it first. They always do. Every new batch of students brought with them curious eyes and playful energy, but within weeks the same pattern repeated: whispers spreading during recess, hushed voices in the cafeteria, rumors that grew sharper with every telling. They said there was a door deep in the lower hallway, hidden behind rusted lockers and peeling paint, a door that no teacher ever unlocked. Some swore they had seen it sealed with chains, others claimed it was just another supply closet. But no one had ever seen what was behind it. The mystery became a ghost story of its own, a rite of passage to even dare touch the knob before a teacher caught you. For the teachers, these stories were little more than childish imagination. They brushed them off, warning students not to wander into restricted areas. Yet, their dismissals often carried a strange edge, as if they weren't entirely comfortable denying the rumors. Some avoided the subject altogether, their eyes darting away whenever the basement was mentioned. It was the kind of silence that only made the whispers stronger. Every school has its legends. A girl who vanished in the middle of the night. A janitor who heard screams echoing long after the halls were empty. A notebook left behind, filled with strange drawings no one could explain. At first, they sound like harmless tales designed to scare younger kids, but over time, the stories around this school began to take on a different weight. Older students remembered hearing the same accounts from their parents, who had once been students themselves. Rumors didn't die with graduation, they passed down, like an inheritance nobody wanted. And then there was the sound. Those who had spent enough time in the old building claimed that at night, when the hallways were quiet, you could hear a faint thud beneath the floor. Not the creak of old pipes or the settling of wood, but something heavier, rhythmic, as though someone, or something, was moving below. The school board blamed faulty construction. Teachers laughed it off. But the sound lingered, impossible to unhear once you had noticed it. The town itself seemed to grow uneasy about the school. Parents warned their children to stay away after dark. Local kids dared each other to sneak in, filming shaky videos on their phones that showed long, dimly lit corridors where shadows seemed to move on their own. None of the footage ever showed anything definitive, but there was always something unsettling about the way the camera shook, as if even the one holding it felt the weight of the place pressing down on them. Still, life went on. Classes were held, lessons taught, laughter echoing in the gymnasium. But beneath it all, the unanswered question remained: why was there a door that no one opened? Why was there a part of the school nobody spoke about? One winter, a snowstorm forced students and staff to stay inside longer than usual. Power flickered, and the emergency lights hummed faintly. Several children swore they saw a shadow slip across the bottom hallway, not a teacher, not a student, but something taller, darker, standing exactly where the sealed door was rumored to be. When they told their parents, the story was brushed off as imagination. But that night, one mother admitted quietly to her child, "We used to see it too." And so the story endured. A door, locked and forgotten. Whispers in the halls. A heaviness beneath the floors. Most dismissed it, but some knew better. Because in this school, the basement wasn't just another room. It was something no one was supposed to discover. Long before the rumors, before the whispers of the basement spread like wildfire among children, the school itself was a source of pride. When its foundation was laid, more than a century ago, the townspeople gathered to watch the cornerstone being set into place. Photographs from that day show smiling faces, men in suits with their hats pressed against their chests, women holding the hands of children who would one day walk the very halls rising before them. To the community, this building wasn't just brick and stone, it was a promise. A place where futures would be written. The town was small, hemmed in by long stretches of farmland and forests, where winters were bitter and summers thick with heat. For decades, opportunities here were scarce. Factories in neighboring cities drew away workers, leaving behind families with little but hope that their children might one day escape the same cycle of poverty. The school was meant to be their salvation. It was built larger than the town seemed to need, as if the planners envisioned a future where more children would fill its classrooms. A statement of ambition, or perhaps, something else. Newspapers at the time wrote of a model institution, modern in every sense. Articles described airy classrooms, wide staircases, and, curiously, a basement level that was said to house essential infrastructure. What that meant was never elaborated on. Early blueprints showed heating systems and storage marked in vague detail, with no mention of a separate chamber. Perhaps no one thought much of it then. The first principal, Mr. Edward Hargrove, was a towering man with a reputation for strict discipline. Photographs show him with sharp features, always in a dark suit, standing apart from his staff in school portraits. Former students remembered him as stern but fair, until they didn't. As years went on, stories of his punishments began to spread. Not in the newspapers, of course, but quietly, in kitchens and on porches, whispered by parents whose children came home pale, unwilling to speak of what had happened when they had misbehaved. Teachers rotated in and out with unusual frequency. Some stayed only a year before leaving without explanation. Others lasted longer but later spoke of strange policies and unsettling rules that were never officially documented. The school board maintained a spotless record, ensuring that whatever happened within those walls stayed firmly contained. Still, cracks began to appear. In 1923, a student was reported to have transferred suddenly after an incident no one detailed. In 1934, a custodian allegedly fell down the stairs to the lower level and broke his neck. His death was ruled accidental, yet no obituary was published, and his family never received compensation. Decades later, construction reports revealed the staircase had been sealed not long after. Officially, the decision was attributed to structural safety concerns. But those who had worked in the building knew better. That staircase didn't lead to storage, it led somewhere else. Through the 1940s and 1950s, the town changed. Wars came and went, industries shifted, but the school remained. Its bell tower watched silently as generations of children marched through its doors. It became a landmark, the kind people used when giving directions: turn left at the old school. Yet even as it became part of the town's identity, its presence carried a shadow. Parents spoke of the place with unease. Children dreaded being kept late after class, when the hallways grew dark and the silence pressed in. By the 1960s, whispers about the building had grown. The basement had already become the stuff of legend, even then. Students dared each other to go near it. Some swore the door had been bricked up during renovations, others claimed they had seen light flicker beneath its edges. What's curious is how little official documentation exists about these renovations. Permits were vague, inspections incomplete. It was as though someone wanted the lower level forgotten, or at least, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. The 1970s brought its own scandals. Enrollment began to drop, and rumors of mismanagement circulated. Teachers once again left abruptly. A few were interviewed years later, admitting they had been told never to ask about certain rooms, never to take students downstairs for any reason. The silence was enforced not with threats, but with an unspoken understanding: if you wanted to keep your job, you didn't ask questions. Even so, questions persisted. In 1981, a young journalist named Sarah Whitmore requested access to the school's archives for a feature she was writing about forgotten landmarks. She was denied entry. When she pressed, the school board stated bluntly, certain files are missing. Whitmore noted this publicly in a short column, but her story went no further. She died in a car accident the following year, just outside of town. Officially unrelated, but locals whispered otherwise. The years passed. The school continued to operate, though it never fully escaped the sense of something hidden within its walls. Alumni spoke fondly of their friends, their sports teams, their favorite teachers, but always with a shadow lingering over the conversation. Everyone seemed to know there was something they weren't supposed to talk about. It is here, in this silence, that the legend of the basement grew. Not as a story of imagination, but as a hole in the record. Something was missing, deliberately. And in a place built on the promise of education and opportunity, that silence became louder with each generation that walked through its halls. Years later, when the blueprints resurfaced, tucked away in a municipal office file no one had touched in decades, one detail stood out. A room was marked faintly in pencil on the lowest level, a room with no entrance, no designation, no explanation. An empty square in a sea of lines, waiting to be rediscovered. Stories have a way of clinging to certain places. In the old school, the whispers never stopped, they only grew louder as each new generation passed through its doors. What began as childhood dares and eerie jokes eventually evolved into something heavier, darker. Because unlike the legends most schools carry, these weren't just playful ghost stories. They carried details too sharp, too consistent to be brushed aside. It often began with sound. Former students recalled how, late in the afternoon, when classes had ended and the building grew quiet, they would hear faint noises drifting up from below. It wasn't the creak of pipes or the hum of old machinery. It was something else, soft footsteps where no one was supposed to walk, a dragging sound like furniture being pulled across stone floors. Some described a rhythmic tapping, as though knuckles or fingertips rapped slowly against the walls beneath their feet. Teachers explained it away as the settling of the old building. But children notice when adults are lying. By the 1950s, the rumors had taken root so deeply that the basement became a rite of passage. Students dared each other to sneak down the lower hallway, to lay their hand on the sealed door and hold it there for 5 full seconds. Those who managed it returned pale, swearing they felt a chill seep into their bones, colder than winter itself. Others said the metal of the lock burned hot against their skin, as if the door carried its own strange pulse. One story told among alumni still circulates today. In the early 1960s, a boy named Daniel was known for being fearless, the type to mock his friends for believing in childish tales. One afternoon, he boasted that he would not only touch the basement door but open it. His classmates followed him, nervous but eager to watch. Daniel pressed his ear against the metal, then suddenly jerked back, eyes wide. "There's someone inside," he whispered. When he turned to laugh, his face was pale. He never spoke of it again. Strangely, the following year, Daniel transferred schools without warning. Official records list family relocation, but his friends always swore that something happened to him that day. Then there were the disappearances, subtle, easily forgotten in the official record but never erased from memory. Students recalled classmates who seemed to vanish overnight. A girl named Claire in the 1970s, bright and lively, who one day simply stopped showing up. Teachers said she had moved away, but none of her friends remembered her family packing or saying goodbye. Years later, her name was found scribbled faintly on the edge of a desk stored in the attic. Claire was here. Another came in the 1980s. A boy named Thomas, quiet, with a habit of sketching in the margins of his notebooks. He was last seen walking near the basement staircase. His disappearance was reported, but the case file thinned quickly. The explanation given to parents was vague, shifting from, "he ran away," to, "his family relocated." But the parents never left town. To this day, they keep a photograph of their son in the window, faded by the sun, waiting for answers that never came. The janitors, too, carried their share of secrets. One elderly custodian, interviewed decades later, described how he avoided the lower hallway whenever he worked the night shift. He claimed he once unlocked the wrong door by mistake, opening a passage that led to the sealed stairwell. "I heard breathing," he whispered, his eyes wet. But there was nobody there. He retired shortly after, never speaking of it again until the interview, years later, when he admitted he still dreamed of that sound. Teachers, bound by duty, rarely acknowledged the stories. Yet occasionally, their silences spoke louder than words. A retired teacher confessed that during her first year she attempted to take a shortcut to the basement storage. The headmaster stopped her abruptly, gripping her arm tightly enough to leave marks. "That part of the school is not for you," he warned. She never tried again. As the years marched forward, the stories blurred between fact and folklore, yet certain patterns never changed. Children continued to speak of cold spots in the lower hallway, of strange writing scratched faintly into the plaster. Words and languages they didn't know, markings that were scrubbed away only to reappear weeks later. Some swore they saw figures moving in their peripheral vision, shadows that vanished when they turned their heads. In the early 1990s, a group of teenagers snuck into the school after hours with a camcorder. The shaky footage, grainy and dark, still circulates among locals. It shows them laughing nervously, making their way toward the basement door. At one point, the camera catches what appears to be movement in the corner, a fleeting shape, taller than any of the students, gliding across the frame. The teens scream and run, their laughter turning to panic. When asked later, they insisted it wasn't a prank. The tape ends abruptly as if cut short. One of those students, now an adult, later admitted something chilling. The night after filming, he dreamt of standing in the basement. He couldn't see the walls, only darkness stretching endlessly. In the dream, a line of children stood beside him, silent, facing the black. He recognized some of their faces, kids from school he remembered vaguely, children who had moved away. He woke drenched in sweat and refused to watch the tape again. By the time the school neared its final decades, the basement was no longer just a rumor. It had become an unspoken truth. Everyone knew there was something down there, though no one dared to name it. The stories had accumulated, layered over decades, impossible to dismiss as mere imagination. And then came the testimony that shifted everything. A former student, now in his 40s, admitted during a local oral history project that he once had a friend who disappeared without explanation. They were both 12. The last time he saw his friend was the day he dared to follow the sound of footsteps down to the lower hallway. "He never came back," the man said, his voice trembling. "They told us his family left town. But I know that isn't true. I watched him walk toward the basement door. And I never saw him again." It was the kind of statement that turned ghost stories into something far more unsettling, because legends can be ignored, but testimonies, spoken with fear and grief, leave marks that linger. It had been decades since the basement was first whispered about. The building, now aged and worn, had survived generations of students, teachers, and renovations. Its red bricks had dulled, paint peeled from walls, and the hallways echoed differently, hollowed by time. It was during one of these renovations, a project meant to modernize the aging school, that the first undeniable discovery was made. What had been legend became reality. Construction crews were assigned to replace old flooring, update electrical wiring, and reinforce crumbling staircases. Among them was a man named Martin Clark, a veteran worker known for his meticulous attention to detail. Clark had heard the rumors, everyone in town had, but he had always dismissed them. He was practical, grounded, and uninterested in ghost stories. Yet even he felt a subtle tension as he moved through the lower hallway, his boots crunching on the dust-covered tiles. The work was tedious at first. Pipes were replaced, plaster patched, and tiles lifted to inspect foundations. Clark and his team joked about haunted classrooms and the kids' basement stories, laughing to ease the growing sense of unease. Still, every few steps, Clark felt a chill that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. A dull hum vibrated faintly under the floorboards. He shrugged it off, attributing it to old infrastructure. But as the day wore on, the feeling became harder to ignore. It was a narrow corridor near the gym that first hinted at something unusual. The crew had been removing a section of floor when Clark's crowbar struck a hollow sound. Unlike the solid timber around it, this section produced a deep, almost metallic thud. Curiosity overcame routine. Clark knelt and traced the edges of the anomaly. Beneath layers of dust, grime, and decades of neglect, he discovered a small latch, rusted and hidden beneath a warped wooden panel. He called the foreman over. Together, they pried at the latch, expecting perhaps a forgotten utility closet. But the resistance of the door beneath suggested something more substantial. The metal groaned, chains rattled as they struggled. The workers exchanged uneasy glances. None of the blueprints had indicated a door in this location. It was as though the building itself was holding back a secret it had carried for nearly a century. When the door finally gave way, a puff of cold air burst out, carrying a scent that none could identify, a mix of dust, damp earth, and something far more unsettling. Their flashlights revealed stone steps spiraling downward, coated with decades of debris. The walls were cold, uneven, and scratched with faint markings. Shadows leapt unnaturally from the beam of each flashlight, creating the illusion of movement. For a moment, even the most skeptical workers felt a creeping apprehension. Clark was the first to step inside. His boots echoed against stone, a hollow sound that magnified the quiet. Each step seemed heavier than the last. The air grew colder the further they descended, and the narrow space constricted around them like the embrace of something alive. Wooden crates lay strewn across the floor, some broken, their contents long decayed. Paper fragments, rusted metal, and old furniture were scattered in apparent disarray. It was clear immediately that this was not a simple storage area. Among the debris, Clark noticed writing scratched into the walls. Names, dates, strange symbols, and some words that had faded into illegibility. At first, it seemed random, perhaps the work of bored students over decades. But as the workers moved deeper, patterns began to emerge, clusters of names that repeated, some underlined, others circled. The implication was chilling: the basement had been used in ways that were deliberate, methodical, and hidden. The team stopped at a small alcove. Chains were bolted to the floor, rusted yet intact. Nearby, the remnants of desks and chairs were scattered in a way that suggested more than mere neglect. Clark's flashlight caught something unexpected, a notebook lying in the corner, its cover warped with age but still intact. Inside were lists of names, some matched the scratched wall inscriptions. Others were incomplete, their endings abruptly cut off. The handwriting varied, neat, careful, and in some cases, trembling. A sense of gravity fell over the team. Jokes vanished. The basement, once a mere curiosity, now carried the weight of unknown histories. Clark felt a sinking certainty that the stories from decades past were not exaggerated. This was the place the rumors had whispered about, the part of the school that nobody was supposed to see. And now, finally, it had been uncovered. Word spread quickly once the discovery was reported. Local authorities arrived to investigate. Photographers documented the entrance and the stairwell. Archival researchers began poring over decades-old files, hoping to reconcile the existence of this hidden space with official records that denied it ever existed. Yet the deeper they delved, the less they found. Blueprints didn't match reality. Maintenance logs were incomplete. And the people who might have explained the basement, long-retired staff, deceased teachers, silent board members, were either unreachable or unwilling to speak. Meanwhile, students who had returned to witness the discovery described a mixture of awe and terror. Some recalled hearing faint whispers, others the feeling of eyes on them where no one should have been. A few said the walls seemed to breathe, as if the darkness itself had a pulse. The official reports were clinical, dry, and reassuring, but they could not erase what had been felt, seen, or smelled by those present. By the end of the first day, it was evident that the basement was far more than a forgotten storage space. It was a repository of decades of secrets, a physical archive of events that had been deliberately buried. And as Clark descended the narrow stairs one last time, flashlight in hand, he realized something no one wanted to admit: what lay below had been waiting for discovery for generations, and in revealing it, they had awakened a story that would refuse to stay hidden. The moment the workers and investigators fully entered the basement, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't just the cold, which had intensified with each descending step, or the damp smell of decay and rust. It was something more elusive, a weight pressing against the chest, a silence so complete it felt deliberate, like the walls themselves were listening. The basement had a character of its own, a presence that seemed older than the building above, almost sentient in its stillness. Flashlights cut jagged beams across the room. Dust motes floated in the air, disturbed by movement, but otherwise the space remained motionless. Broken furniture lay scattered, some partially buried under layers of debris. Rusted lockers leaned precariously against stone walls, their doors creaking when touched. The floor was uneven, covered in a patchwork of cracked tiles, splintered wood, and grime that hinted at years without care. Every step echoed, bouncing between walls in a way that made the space feel far larger than it should have been. Investigators noted a chilling detail: the layout was irregular, almost labyrinthine. Narrow corridors branched off into alcoves, some no wider than a single person, others opening into larger chambers. Certain passages seemed to have been deliberately obscured, blocked with makeshift walls, debris, and heavy furniture. Nothing in the official blueprints accounted for these areas. It was as if whoever built or modified this basement wanted it hidden in plain sight, a secret concealed by structure itself. The walls were covered with more than dust and scratches. Marks etched into the plaster, some deep and deliberate, others faint and hurried, told a story of those who had been there before. Names, dates, cryptic symbols, and odd diagrams suggested systematic documentation of people or events. Some investigators speculated they were recordings of punishment, or perhaps experiments of an unknown nature. Each symbol carried a weight, a hint of fear and precision, leaving no doubt that this was no ordinary storage area. Among the scattered debris were remnants of furniture, many of which were too small to have been made for adults. Tiny chairs, broken desks, and remnants of what appeared to be educational materials lay abandoned and decayed. It was as though this basement had once been a mirror of the school above, classrooms of an entirely different, darker kind. Investigators paused often, noting the eerie juxtaposition: a place designed for learning had been transformed into a chamber of confinement. Chains bolted to the floor drew the team's attention. Rusted yet intact, some were embedded deep into stone, suggesting that whatever had been held here was restrained for long periods. The investigators exchanged uneasy glances, each considering the implications. The air seemed heavier around these chains, colder, carrying a faint metallic tang. It was impossible to ignore the thought: this basement had not been built for storage, not for maintenance. It had been built for control. A notebook found earlier now became central to understanding the space. Its pages, filled with names, dates, and brief notes, matched scratches on the walls. Some names appeared multiple times, each instance accompanied by subtle annotations, ticks, circles, or crosses. While investigators struggled to interpret the handwriting, the pattern suggested something systematic, organized, yet horrifyingly opaque. There was evidence of meticulous recording, yet the records were incomplete, leaving terrifying gaps that fueled speculation. The silence of the basement amplified every small sound. Footsteps, the scrape of a chair, the tap of a flashlight against the wall, each echoed unnaturally, distorting perception. One investigator swore he heard faint whispers, indistinct, just beyond the reach of reason. Others reported similar phenomena: fleeting shadows, the sense of being watched, and sudden cold spots that seemed to move through the room rather than emanate from any single source. Rational explanations, drafts, acoustics, imagination, failed to account for the intensity of the experience. As the team pressed deeper, they encountered chambers that defied immediate explanation. In one alcove, remnants of what appeared to be sleeping areas, tattered mattresses, small pillows, and threadbare blankets, lay stacked against the wall. Nearby, faint stains suggested long-abandoned use. The arrangement hinted at habitation, but not ordinary habitation. It was austere, controlled, almost clinical in its precision. The contrast between these items and the ordinary educational supplies found elsewhere created a dissonance that made even seasoned investigators uneasy. Other rooms revealed the remnants of discarded experiments or activities whose purpose remained ambiguous. Broken instruments, metal devices with unknown function, and piles of paper with coded symbols littered the floors. Some objects were corroded beyond identification, others appeared to be intentionally hidden beneath debris, perhaps meant never to be found. Every discovery compounded the impression that the basement had been designed as a repository of secrets, secrets so disturbing that time itself had been enlisted to conceal them. The basement's layout forced the team to move slowly, deliberately. Corners were rounded with age, passageways narrowed unpredictably, and ceilings dipped in unexpected places. The spatial irregularity made it impossible to gain an immediate sense of the whole. Even with multiple flashlights and cameras, the investigators could only glimpse fragments of the space, each fragment raising more questions than answers. It was a place that resisted comprehension, a puzzle deliberately made incomplete. Among the walls were symbols that seemed to recur in different chambers, a pattern that suggested a system, a code, or a ritual of some kind. Certain rooms contained markings that aligned with specific chains or furniture, almost as if the layout itself was an instruction, or a record. Investigators speculated that the basement had been repurposed repeatedly over decades, with each iteration leaving behind new symbols, notes, and objects. The deeper they explored, the more it became clear that nothing had been left to chance. Yet the most unnerving aspect was the palpable sense of absence. The basement was full of traces of people, yet completely devoid of life. Footsteps, whispers, chains, notebooks, furniture, symbols, all spoke of presence, but the present was gone. It was as if the basement was a vessel of memory, capturing fear, suffering, and secrecy within its stone walls. Every visitor left changed, burdened with the knowledge that the space had witnessed events that the world above refused to acknowledge. And as the investigators reached the farthest corner, where light barely touched the stone walls, a realization struck them. They had only seen a fraction of the basement. Beyond the passageways, beyond the corridors and alcoves, there were areas still obscured by debris, hidden behind walls that might have been intentionally constructed to remain secret. Whatever lay beyond these unseen spaces, it was clear, would challenge everything they thought they knew about the school, and perhaps the town itself. In that silence, the basement seemed to breathe. The air grew heavier, carrying with it the weight of forgotten voices and unanswered questions. The investigators knew, though they dared not speak it aloud, that this was only the beginning. They had uncovered the basement, yes, but its stories, its secrets, and its horrors were far from fully revealed. And in that moment, as they turned their flashlights toward the unknown corridors, the basement seemed to whisper back, "You were never meant to be here." Discovery of the basement ignited a firestorm of questions, questions that were far more complex than any construction crew could answer. The first place investigators turned was the school board, hoping that decades of official records might shed light on the mysterious lower levels. What they found instead was silence, obfuscation, and a meticulously maintained trail of omissions. The basement, it seemed, had been known about for decades, yet every mention of it had been carefully erased from public records. Initial FOIA requests brought back heavily redacted memos, vague statements about restricted areas and maintenance safety concerns, and several reports of children or staff being moved elsewhere without explanation. Pages were missing. Names had been blacked out. Every attempt to uncover the truth seemed to encounter the same barrier, a wall of deliberate inaction. Those who were in positions of authority during previous decades, principals, superintendents, board members, either refused to comment or offered statements so rehearsed they left investigators unsettled. Among the few who spoke was a retired janitor, a man who had spent nearly 40 years in the school service. When asked about the basement, he hesitated, shifting his gaze to the floor. "They told me never to go down there," he whispered. "And I didn't. Not once. But, sometimes I'd hear noises. Things I shouldn't have. And the principal, he always knew." His hands trembled as he recounted locked doors, chains, and the faint, persistent smell of dampness that seemed to come from nowhere. The basement, he implied, had been more than a storage space, it was a controlled, deliberate place of secrecy. Investigators pieced together what they could from these testimonies and remaining documentation. One memorandum, dated 1967, instructed staff to ensure certain areas remain restricted from student access, without specifying which areas. Another, written in 1974, referred cryptically to a potential liability issue regarding the lower levels of the school, suggesting that someone in authority had been aware of the dangers but chose to ignore them. Footnotes in various reports referenced previous incidents, injuries, missing students, sudden transfers, but in every case, explanations were either absent or deliberately vague. The pattern became unmistakable. Authority figures, from principals to school board members, were aware of the basement and its potential horrors, and yet chose silence over disclosure. Why? Some investigators suggested fear of scandal, others speculated on darker motives, a need to maintain a pristine image for the community at any cost. Whatever the reasoning, the effect was the same. Children and staff were left vulnerable, their experiences erased or rewritten to fit a sanitized narrative. Among the most haunting discoveries were photographs and archived reports that had been tucked away in forgotten municipal storage rooms. One photograph, taken in the late 1950s, shows a group of children standing near a staircase leading down to a sealed area. They are smiling awkwardly at the camera, unaware of what lay beneath their feet. Behind them, a teacher or staff member hovers, expression unreadable. The image is mundane at first glance, but the familiarity of the children, now identified as some of the names scratched into the basement walls, made investigators pause. What had been photographed? And why was this image never published or reported? Another chilling piece of evidence was a notebook, once belonging to a former board member, which contained cryptic entries regarding special sessions and disciplinary measures conducted in the lower levels. The writing hinted at systematic procedures carried out over years, procedures that were never explained to parents, never documented in official school records, and never acknowledged publicly. The implications were staggering. The basement had been a stage for events sanctioned, if not orchestrated, by those in authority. Families of missing or transferred students began to speak out. Their stories added human depth to the investigation, revealing how bureaucratic silence translated into generational trauma. Parents described phone calls that went unanswered, meetings with administrators that ended abruptly, and the quiet sense that something more sinister had occurred than the official records admitted. One mother recalled pleading with the principal to investigate her daughter's sudden disappearance. He smiled, patting her shoulder, and said, "Don't worry. She's safe. You just don't understand." Years later, she would come to understand, too late to change the past. The investigators also uncovered subtle forms of intimidation and coercion. Teachers who tried to raise questions were transferred, reprimanded, or quietly encouraged to resign. Custodial staff who noticed irregularities were warned off. Even students who witnessed odd happenings were disciplined for reporting them. The silence was enforced not only through omission but through active suppression, a web of authority protecting secrets too dark to face publicly. Despite decades of cover-ups, small breadcrumbs of truth survived. Handwritten letters, long forgotten in desk drawers or personal archives, hinted at knowledge of the basement and fear surrounding it. One letter from 1962 described a student, kept downstairs against her will, warning that, "the adults in charge will protect themselves at any cost." Another note, hidden in the margins of a teacher's lesson plan, simply read, "Do not go there. You will regret it." These fragments, though incomplete, confirmed what many had suspected, that someone in power had deliberately hidden the basement's existence and its activities from the world. The atmosphere among investigators shifted as the evidence accumulated. The basement was no longer simply a physical space but a symbol of systemic secrecy. The walls themselves seemed to carry the weight of authority's deliberate neglect. Each chain, each scratched name, each faded photograph pointed to the same truth: decades of governance had failed to protect the vulnerable, choosing reputation over morality, silence over justice. Even as the investigation gained momentum, new mysteries surfaced. The more investigators learned, the more questions remained. Why had the basement been allowed to exist for so long? Who was responsible for its concealment? What exact events had taken place in its shadowed corridors? And perhaps most chilling of all, what had been done to ensure it remained hidden, even as generations of children walked above it, oblivious? In documenting these revelations, the team began to understand the magnitude of what they had uncovered. The basement was a nexus of secrecy, where authority had deliberately erased history to protect itself. But the human element, the memories of survivors, the testimony of staff, the grief of families, ensured that some part of the truth could not be buried. It was a silent rebellion against erasure, whispering across decades, demanding recognition. By the end of their review, the investigators had amassed a dossier of evidence that defied denial. Reports, photographs, letters, interviews, and redacted memos painted a portrait of systematic concealment and moral failure. The basement, once merely a rumor whispered among students, was now exposed as a space whose story had been deliberately suppressed by those entrusted with power. And in revealing it, the investigation revealed another truth just as unsettling: authority alone could not protect a secret once it was discovered, and some silences could never remain unbroken. After weeks of poring over documents, photographs, and testimonies, the investigators realized the magnitude of the puzzle before them. Each fragment of evidence, a scratched name on a wall, a redacted report, a faded photograph, represented a thread, and their task was to weave them together into a coherent narrative. But the deeper they delved, the more elusive the truth became. Patterns emerged, yet they only raised new questions. It began with the notebooks found in the basement. Every page was a carefully written record, listing names, dates, and brief annotations. Some entries were simple, a student's name and a date. Others were cryptic, accompanied by symbols or shorthand that resisted immediate interpretation. By comparing these entries to archived school records, the team identified a chilling pattern: many names corresponded to students who had disappeared or been transferred under mysterious circumstances. It was a connection too deliberate to ignore. Cross-referencing these records with municipal archives revealed additional anomalies. Transfer requests and attendance logs were incomplete. Certain files had been removed entirely, leaving gaps that coincided with entries in the basement notebooks. The investigators began to see a timeline emerge: a web of disappearances, sudden relocations, and vague explanations, all linked to the same hidden area beneath the school. This was no coincidence. Someone had orchestrated a pattern of concealment across decades. The team interviewed former students who had survived these events. Their testimonies added an emotional depth that documents could never convey. A woman in her 40s recounted how, at the age of 12, she had dared to peek down the basement hallway and seen shadows that moved independently of any person. She described the feeling of being watched, the chill in the air, and the subtle whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Even decades later, she said, the memory haunted her dreams. Another former student spoke of a friend who vanished after being dared to touch the basement door. He remembered the boy's face turning pale, the way his laughter died in his throat, and how he never saw him again. These stories were corroborated by the notebook's entries: the missing boy's name marked, repeated, annotated with symbols whose meaning remained unclear. The investigators realized they were not just piecing together events, they were connecting human lives to the physical traces left in the basement. As the team dug deeper, they discovered a disturbing element of continuity. Names from the 1950s were echoed in the 1970s and again in the 1990s. Some students returned years later to visit the school as alumni, only to report the same feelings: cold spots, whispering shadows, and the unmistakable sensation that the basement was aware of them. Investigators began to suspect that the basement itself had become a repository of trauma, absorbing the fear, confusion, and suffering of those who had entered it. The investigation took a new turn when they examined the physical layout of the basement more closely. Using modern scanning technology, the team mapped hidden recesses, blocked off passageways, and concealed rooms that had eluded construction crews decades earlier. Certain chambers were deliberately obscured behind false walls or debris. The investigators hypothesized that these spaces were used to control or isolate students, though the exact nature of what occurred remained unclear. The evidence suggested systematic manipulation, an environment designed to conceal events as they unfolded. One particularly chilling discovery involved a series of coded symbols etched into the walls of several chambers. These symbols appeared repeatedly in notebooks and on the stone, creating a lattice of meaning that hinted at ritualized or methodical practices. Experts in cryptography were consulted to interpret them, but even they could not fully decipher the sequences. The repeated patterns suggested order, a deliberate recording system, but the purpose remained elusive. Were these disciplinary markers, inventory lists, or something darker entirely? The ambiguity intensified the tension, leaving investigators and viewers alike on edge. The human cost became more apparent as the team linked names, symbols, and testimonies. Each missing or transferred student was a story frozen in time, their presence reduced to annotations on a page or scratches in the wall. Families who had long accepted vague explanations were given new context, revealing decades of bureaucratic erasure. One mother, reviewing her son's notebook entry decades later, broke down in tears upon recognizing the date of his disappearance annotated next to a symbol she had never understood. The investigation became not just an intellectual pursuit, but an emotional reckoning. Investigators also noted an unsettling pattern regarding staff complicity. Certain teachers and administrators had maintained consistent presence across multiple decades, and their roles aligned with many of the recorded entries. Whether through active participation, silent observation, or deliberate inaction, they had been instruments in perpetuating the secrecy. Cross-referencing their service records with the notebook's timeline revealed a continuity that suggested intentional oversight. The web of complicity was both precise and terrifying, implicating generations of authority figures in a conspiracy of silence. A breakthrough occurred when investigators interviewed a retired principal who had once attempted to report irregularities. He revealed that in the 1960s, he had discovered the hidden staircase leading to a small chamber. Terrified by what he saw, chains, scattered furniture, and cryptic annotations on the walls, he had been warned by the school board to remain silent. "They told me," he said, voice trembling, "that the town would never understand. That I should protect myself and my career." His testimony provided the missing link. The basement had been known, monitored, and protected by those in power for decades. As connections solidified, a narrative emerged that was as chilling as it was incomplete. The basement had been systematically used to isolate, monitor, and record children, while those in authority maintained the illusion of normalcy above. The notebooks, symbols, and hidden chambers were not random, they were artifacts of methodical oversight. The investigators began to understand the full scope of the concealment, the layers of bureaucracy, the deliberate omissions, the human cost. Yet despite assembling this extensive mosaic, certain mysteries remained. Some names in the notebooks could not be traced. Certain symbols defied interpretation. And the psychological impact on survivors could only be speculated. The investigation had connected many pieces, but the puzzle was intentionally fragmented. The basement, it seemed, had been designed to resist complete understanding, leaving investigators and viewers suspended in a state of perpetual unease. By the end of the mapping and cross-referencing phase, the team had constructed a timeline spanning decades, linking physical evidence, written records, and oral testimonies. It was not a complete picture, but it was enough to establish a terrifying pattern. The basement was no mere architectural anomaly. It was a space of deliberate concealment, meticulously maintained across generations, and it had shaped countless lives in ways that official records could never acknowledge. In connecting the missing pieces, investigators achieved a fragile understanding, an outline of the truth hidden in shadows. Yet with every discovery came a realization of scale. The basement had been active, secretive, and dangerous for nearly a century. The human stories etched into its walls, combined with the bureaucratic silence above, revealed a chilling intersection of memory, authority, and trauma. Every fragment of evidence pointed to the same conclusion: the basement was more than a place. It was a repository of human fear, suffering, and concealment, a silent witness to a history that had been buried by those who held power. By the time investigators were ready to fully explore the deepest recesses of the basement, the atmosphere had thickened with anticipation. They knew, from the documents, testimonies, and the labyrinthine layout, that what they were about to encounter would redefine the story entirely. The basement was no longer merely a hidden space, it was a vessel of decades of trauma, concealment, and cruelty. The first chamber they entered after descending the narrow spiral staircase was smaller than expected, almost claustrophobic. Dust hung heavy in the air, clinging to their lungs, and the only light came from the flashlights bouncing off the rough stone walls. As their eyes adjusted, they noticed objects strewn across the floor, broken furniture, tattered clothing, and faint stains whose origin could only be guessed at. The sense of decay was visceral, as if the room itself absorbed time and suffering, holding it in suspension. It was the chains that drew their attention first. Rusted but firmly anchored to the stone floor, they formed a grid that suggested systematic restraint. Some were connected to metal rings embedded into the walls, others to old wooden posts that had partially collapsed under decades of neglect. Investigators measured the spacing, the tension, and the wear, everything suggested repeated use. The basement was a site of containment, but what had been contained, and for how long, remained horrifyingly unknown. Beyond the chains, notebooks, and faded photographs, the team discovered smaller, more intimate artifacts that told disturbing personal stories. Toys, handmade trinkets, and scraps of paper with childish handwriting hinted at the presence of very young occupants. One investigator picked up a small, partially torn notebook. Inside, crude sketches of rooms, figures, and patterns were annotated with names and dates. The innocence of the drawings clashed violently with the purpose implied by the basement's layout. The juxtaposition created a sense of cognitive dissonance, beauty and horror coexisting in the same space. As they pressed deeper into the network of corridors, investigators found evidence that suggested not all spaces had been used at the same time. Layers of debris, varying wear on the stone floor, and differences in wall markings indicated that the basement had been adapted repeatedly across decades. Each generation of occupants, it seemed, had left a trace, a name scratched into a wall, a mark on the floor, a discarded object. The basement was alive with the ghosts of past inhabitants, each leaving behind a fragment of their experience. One chamber, larger than the others, contained what appeared to be a makeshift classroom, desks aligned in rows, though several were broken or overturned. The walls bore chalk markings, diagrams, and phrases that were partially erased or faded. Some inscriptions were mundane, simple equations, drawings of animals, reminders of lessons. Others were cryptic, almost ritualistic, forming patterns that suggested order and purpose beyond education. Investigators struggled to reconcile the familiar with the sinister, the innocence of learning juxtaposed against the evidence of containment and control. In a corner, partially hidden beneath debris, the team discovered evidence of older, more deliberate modifications. Walls had been reinforced, ceilings lowered, and certain alcoves sealed off with heavy planks. The craftsmanship suggested forethought and intentionality. Whoever had designed these spaces was meticulous, ensuring secrecy and control. Investigators noted that these modifications were consistent with the timeline suggested by the notebooks. Changes were implemented systematically, correlating with names and dates of recorded students. The sensory impact of the basement grew as the team ventured further. Cold spots intensified unpredictably, and shadows seemed to move beyond the reach of flashlights. Whispers, faint but persistent, were reported by several members, though they could not be captured on audio recording. The psychological strain became palpable, rational explanations faltered under the weight of what was visible and what was felt. The basement was no longer just a physical space, it had become an emotional and psychological environment, capable of affecting perception and mood. Investigators uncovered more personal items, clothing, shoes, and even a single, worn stuffed animal. Each object hinted at life once present, now vanished. It was evidence of children, undoubtedly young, who had been part of the basement's history. The emotional impact was profound. For the investigators, these artifacts transformed abstract horror into tangible reality. These were not just lines in a notebook or markings on a wall, they were remnants of human lives. The most harrowing discovery came when the team entered a chamber at the far end of the basement, previously obscured behind a false wall. Inside, the room was small and barren, the floor scuffed as if from repeated movement. Etched into the walls were hundreds of names, some overlapping, others crossed out or circled repeatedly. Symbols, dates, and annotations suggested meticulous record-keeping, a ledger of human presence and absence. Investigators realized with dawning horror that the walls themselves were documentation, a chronicle of those who had been subjected to whatever had occurred below. A faint scent lingered, metallic, earthy, and faintly sweet. It clung to the air in pockets, often near the walls, as though the stone itself had absorbed the memory of past events. Investigators noted how the smell seemed stronger in certain corners, intensifying the sense of unease. Equipment confirmed high levels of dampness and decay, but no biological source could fully explain the odor. It was as if the basement had its own presence, its own history imprinted in the very walls. Throughout the exploration, investigators documented every detail, sketches, photographs, audio recordings, and notes. Every artifact, scratch, and stain was recorded meticulously. They knew that the public, and future generations, needed a record of what had been uncovered. Yet even as they documented, the basement resisted full understanding. Certain rooms seemed to shift in perception, dimensions subtly distorted, making it impossible to take in the space in a single glance. Finally, one of the team discovered a series of journals, hidden within a cavity behind a collapsed section of wall. The journals contained entries written over several decades, recording observations of students, detailed instructions, and cryptic notations. Some passages referenced behavior, compliance, and punishment, others detailed the design and maintenance of the basement itself. Investigators were struck by the level of detail and the cold detachment with which the entries were written. It became clear that the horror of the basement was not accidental, it was methodically planned, executed, and maintained by human hands. By the time the exploration concluded, the basement had revealed its full horror, a meticulously organized, purpose-built environment that had housed children and young adults under conditions of fear, control, and secrecy. Objects of innocence existed alongside instruments of control. Marks on the walls, chains, and hidden alcoves told a story of systematic oversight and deliberate concealment. The psychological, emotional, and physical traces left behind created a chilling tableau of suffering preserved in stone and shadow. As the team ascended the staircase to the light above, the silence of the basement seemed to follow them. The weight of what had been uncovered pressed against them still, an invisible residue that clung to their clothing, their skin, and their consciousness. They knew that what had been documented would forever alter the narrative of the school, the town, and the generations that had passed through its doors. The horror within the basement was no longer a rumor or legend, it was a verified truth, one whose ramifications would echo far beyond the walls of the old school. The basement's secrets could not remain hidden forever. Once investigators had documented the evidence, word began to spread, first quietly among city officials, then through local historians, and finally to journalists eager to uncover the story. The response was immediate and intense. What had been whispers for decades now became headlines: a hidden basement, decades of missing students, and a cover-up spanning generations of school authority. Local media descended upon the school, cameras flashing and microphones extended, capturing every detail of the investigation. Reporters described the labyrinthine corridors, the rusted chains, and the cryptic markings etched into stone walls. For the community, long accustomed to tales of ghost stories and odd disappearances, the reality was far more shocking than anyone had imagined. Parents, alumni, and residents crowded around the school grounds, eager to witness the truth for themselves, and yet unsure whether they were prepared for what they might find. Interviews with former students brought the human element to the forefront. Adults in their 30s and 40s recounted memories they had buried for decades. One woman described the lingering terror she had felt at age 12, the sense of being watched, and the faint whispers she could never explain. Another spoke of a friend who had disappeared after daring to enter the basement hallway. Their testimonies were raw, emotional, and difficult to watch, providing a stark counterpoint to the cold efficiency of news footage. The basement was no longer an abstract mystery, it was an undeniable human tragedy. Authorities attempted to contain the narrative. Press releases emphasized safety, historical preservation, and the integrity of ongoing investigations. Yet attempts to frame the story as procedural were met with skepticism. Community members demanded answers. How could a school board, administrators, and staff have known about the basement for decades and done nothing? How had so many children been endangered, their disappearances either unexplained or deliberately misrepresented? The public's reaction was a mixture of outrage, fear, and disbelief. Social media amplified the story, spreading it far beyond the town's limits. Images of the basement, the chains, scattered furniture, and cryptic wall markings, circulated online. Video footage of investigators navigating the narrow corridors and dimly lit chambers went viral. Comments ranged from expressions of horror to calls for accountability, creating a digital echo chamber of collective shock. The basement, once a hidden secret, had become a symbol of institutional failure, its notoriety spreading far faster than anyone could have anticipated. As the story gained traction, investigative journalists began to delve deeper into the historical records. Old newspapers, personal letters, and archived files were scrutinized for inconsistencies. Patterns emerged that corroborated the basement's dark history: missing students, sudden transfers, unexplained administrative changes, and decades of silence from those in power. Each revelation deepened the horror and intensified the demand for answers. The narrative that had once been relegated to rumor was now fully in the public eye, forcing a confrontation with a past many had preferred to forget. Community reactions were multifaceted. Parents demanded transparency and accountability. Alumni expressed a mixture of anger and grief, reflecting on the childhood experiences they had long dismissed as mere rumor or imagination. Teachers, both retired and current, were scrutinized for complicity or negligence. Meetings were held, hearings convened, and local officials faced intense questioning. Yet, for all the bureaucratic maneuvering, the human stories remained central. The missing, the frightened, and the traumatized were no longer invisible. One of the most significant moments occurred during a town hall meeting convened to address public concern. Survivors and families of missing students were invited to speak. Their voices trembled with emotion, recounting decades-old events with vivid clarity. A father described receiving vague explanations from school authorities when his daughter disappeared in the 1970s, leaving him to navigate grief and uncertainty alone. A former student recounted the persistent chill in the basement hallway, the feeling of unseen eyes watching her every move. Their testimonies transformed public outrage into empathy and horror. Amid the chaos, investigators emphasized the need for careful documentation. Each artifact, notebook, and photograph had to be preserved. The basement was now both a crime scene and a historical site, its physical integrity crucial to understanding its full history. Preservation teams worked alongside journalists to maintain a record of the space, ensuring that future generations could study the evidence. Every photograph, every video, every written word became part of a collective archive, a testament to what had been hidden for decades. The media coverage was relentless. National outlets picked up the story, turning the local mystery into a nationwide sensation. Headlines emphasized the scale of the concealment, decades of authority silence, a hidden basement, and the mystery of missing students. Each article and segment added layers to the narrative, blending documented evidence with survivor testimony. While some coverage veered toward sensationalism, the core truth remained undeniable: the basement had been real, and the events it had witnessed could no longer be ignored. Despite the media frenzy, questions persisted. Not all missing students could be traced, and not all symbols or markings could be deciphered. Investigators stressed that much remained unknown, cautioning against premature conclusions. The basement, while now visible to the public, retained elements of mystery, its full history still partially obscured by time, silence, and deliberate concealment. Yet even in its unresolved state, the revelation had already left an indelible mark on the community, transforming rumor into reality and fear into collective awareness. By the end of the first week of public exposure, it was clear that the basement had become more than a hidden architectural anomaly. It had become a symbol of secrecy, of human suffering, and of the consequences of authorities' silence. The investigation, once a quiet uncovering of historical anomalies, had become a catalyst for societal reflection, challenging the community to confront uncomfortable truths. The basement's horror, finally brought into the light, demanded recognition, empathy, and accountability, a reckoning decades in the making. The moment the investigation reached its apex, the shocking revelations began to surface, revelations that no one had anticipated, and that reshaped the story entirely. The notebooks, once thought to contain mere names and dates, now revealed a horrifying level of systematic organization. Students, staff, and even visitors had been meticulously tracked, their comings and goings recorded with chilling precision. Every symbol, annotation, and cross-reference pointed to a coordinated operation, not haphazard mismanagement. Investigators discovered that many of the symbols etched into the walls and notebooks were codes for specific events, confinement, punishment, or observation. By cross-referencing dates with known absences and transfers, it became clear that each student had been subject to carefully controlled routines. Some entries even documented behavioral responses, suggesting that the occupants were being monitored psychologically. The basement was no mere storage or maintenance space, it was a laboratory of control, a chamber of human experimentation whose participants were entirely unwilling. One of the most unsettling findings involved a series of journals hidden behind false walls. These journals contained accounts written by staff, detailing daily routines, incidents, and observations of students over decades. The tone was clinical, detached, and methodical. Investigators read passages describing children isolated for hours, sometimes days, with detailed notes on reactions, behavior, and emotional states. The cold, methodical recording of suffering left the team shaken. It became impossible to separate the horror of the basement from the human decisions that had allowed it to exist. Further revelations came from newly uncovered photographs. In one set, children appeared in the basement, some smiling nervously, others frozen with fear. The images were arranged chronologically, showing subtle changes in furniture, layout, and even wall markings. Investigators noted that some children matched names from the notebooks and wall inscriptions. These photographs, previously unknown and long hidden from public view, provided incontrovertible proof. The basement had been active across multiple decades, and the scale of its use was far greater than anyone had imagined. Perhaps the most disturbing evidence involved a series of letters and notes written by some of the students themselves. Hidden in nooks and behind panels, these writings revealed fear, confusion, and desperation. One note, dated 1965, read simply, "They watch everything. Don't trust anyone." Another described patterns of confinement, punishments for minor infractions, and the mental toll of isolation. Reading these words decades later, the investigators felt the immediate, raw presence of the children, voices trapped in time, echoing in the very walls of the basement. In addition to human accounts, the team found evidence of deliberate modification of the basement over time. False walls, reinforced ceilings, and blocked-off passages indicated a sustained effort to maintain secrecy. Investigators concluded that these changes were not incidental, they were planned interventions designed to obscure activity, delay discovery, and control exposure. Whoever had orchestrated these modifications understood the importance of concealing both physical spaces and the human evidence contained within them. Legal documents further confirmed systemic cover-up. Redacted reports, missing files, and letters between administrative figures revealed that authorities were aware of unusual activity in the basement but chose silence over accountability. In one memorandum, a principal noted that certain areas must remain off-limits to prevent scandal, implying direct knowledge of the basement's use. These records connected administrative complicity to decades of hidden abuse, adding another layer of moral and ethical failure to the narrative. Perhaps the most shocking revelation, however, was the psychological and emotional impact on survivors. Interviews with former students revealed long-term trauma, anxiety, and distrust. Several adults recounted recurring nightmares, flashbacks, and an ongoing sense of being watched even in ordinary life. Psychologists consulted by the investigation noted that the basement's influence extended far beyond its physical walls. The psychological imprint of fear and confinement had persisted for decades, altering the course of countless lives. The investigators also uncovered a final, chilling detail: some of the students recorded in the notebooks had no official trace anywhere, no birth certificates, no school records, no public acknowledgement of existence beyond the basement. This suggested that some occupants had been deliberately erased from official memory, their lives entirely hidden from the world above. It was a revelation that underscored the complete control exercised over these individuals. Not only had their physical freedom been constrained, but their very existence had been manipulated and obscured. As the investigation compiled these findings, the scale of the horror became undeniable. The basement was not a single event, an isolated incident, or a forgotten corner of the building. It was a multi-decade institution of fear, control, and concealment, meticulously maintained by those in positions of authority. Every artifact, every note, every chain, and every wall marking was evidence of deliberate human action, and human failure. The weight of this truth was almost suffocating, an oppressive presence that pressed against the investigators long after they had left the physical space. By the conclusion of Section 10, it was clear that the basement story was not merely about architecture or rumor. It was about the intersection of secrecy, authority, and human suffering. It revealed how individuals entrusted with responsibility could manipulate, conceal, and control lives for decades, and how silence can perpetuate trauma across generations. The revelations were so profound, so deeply unsettling, that they demanded reflection, accountability, and vigilance. And yet, even with every photograph, notebook, and testimony brought to light, the investigators recognized that some aspects would remain forever unknown. The basement had been deliberately designed to resist total comprehension, leaving gaps in knowledge, hidden corners, and unanswered questions. These unknowns, however, only intensified the horror, leaving a lingering unease that would persist for anyone who learned of the basement's existence. The shocking revelations, painstakingly uncovered, marked the turning point of the story. What had begun as a rumor, a whispered legend, had transformed into irrefutable truth. The basement, hidden beneath the old school for generations, was a repository of human suffering and institutional failure, and its story was finally being told in full, no longer bound by silence or fear. The basement had been uncovered, the evidence meticulously documented, and the story had reached the public. Yet even with the horrors exposed, the legacy of what had occurred beneath the old school was far from over. The revelations rippled through the community, reshaping memories, relationships, and perceptions of authority. What had once been a whispered legend was now a haunting truth, impossible to ignore or forget. Survivors and families struggled to process decades of secrecy finally brought to light. For many, the basement was no longer just a physical space, it had become a symbol of lost innocence, betrayal, and endurance. Parents who had raised children in the school's shadow now confronted the terrifying possibility that generations had been placed at risk while those in power looked away. The emotional toll was immense, grief, anger, and disbelief mixed in equal measure. Psychologists working with survivors noted recurring themes: unresolved trauma, lingering anxiety, and the pervasive feeling that the basement's influence extended far beyond its stone walls. The school, once a place of learning and routine, became a site of reflection and mourning. Memorials were proposed, commemorating those whose lives had been affected, and public forums were established to share experiences and demand accountability. Former staff were confronted with the magnitude of their complicity or negligence, while the community wrestled with uncomfortable questions: how could such secrecy persist for decades? How had generations of children passed through the hallways above, oblivious to the suffering below? The basement had become a catalyst for collective reckoning. Investigators who had spent months documenting the basement found themselves affected in ways they had not anticipated. The meticulous details, the human artifacts, and the layered history of fear and concealment weighed heavily on their consciousness. Even after leaving the physical space, the sensory memories, the cold drafts, the echoing footsteps, the faint metallic tang in the air, lingered. Some described recurring nightmares, a heightened sensitivity to enclosed spaces, or the unsettling sense that the basement's presence had imprinted itself on their psyche. The investigation had revealed a physical horror, but its psychological resonance was equally enduring. Media coverage continued to keep the story alive, but over time, the narrative evolved. It shifted from immediate shock to reflection on systemic failure, human resilience, and the importance of accountability. Documentaries, news specials, and journalistic exposés explored not only the events themselves but the broader implications, the consequences of institutional silence, the moral responsibility of authority, and the enduring impact of trauma on generations. The basement story had transcended its physical confines, becoming a cautionary tale for society at large. As the dust settled, the school itself faced profound changes. Portions of the building were preserved as historical evidence, while others were renovated or repurposed. Security measures were implemented to prevent future concealment, and administrative oversight was strengthened. Yet, despite these measures, the memory of the basement remained. Students, faculty, and community members carried it forward in conversation, reflection, and memory. It was a haunting reminder that even in spaces of learning, darkness could persist when accountability fails. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of the basement's legacy was the resilience of those who had survived or been affected. Many former students turned their experiences into advocacy, working to ensure that children today are protected from neglect, secrecy, or abuse. Community initiatives were launched to educate the public on the signs of institutional failure and the importance of vigilance. In this way, the basement's haunting presence became a catalyst for positive change, a painful reminder transformed into a source of awareness and protection for future generations. And yet, for all the documentation, testimony, and reflection, some aspects of the basement remained unknowable. Hidden corners, undeciphered symbols, and missing records ensured that mystery persisted. The space retained an aura of the unknown, a silent reminder that not every story can be fully unraveled, and that human actions, both deliberate and negligent, leave legacies that endure far beyond immediate comprehension. The basement was both revealed and concealed, its horror exposed yet partially preserved, a paradox that ensured its story would continue to captivate, haunt, and provoke thought for years to come. In the end, the basement beneath the old school was more than a site of hidden horrors. It was a testament to the consequences of secrecy, the endurance of human suffering, and the resilience of those who confront buried truths. Its legacy was haunting, painful, and transformative, a story that demanded remembrance, reflection, and, above all, vigilance. The echoes of the past lingered, etched into walls, memories, and collective consciousness, a haunting legacy that would never be forgotten.